Welcome to our final installment in our bird's eye view of the book of Revelation. What have we learned so far that we need to keep in mind? First of all, Revelation is apocalyptic literature. That means it reveals something to us, the spiritual world that is beyond our vision, that drives this natural world. Revelation uses symbols that are drawn from Israel's Old Testament to help us understand what's going on. And I say help us, but we are not the intended audience, as sometimes people assume that this is meant for us, but rather this is meant for the church in Asia Minor in the first century when it is written, although, of course, it has value to us today. Revelation puts forward two different ways of being. The first way is called the way of Babylon, that is embodied in John's age by the Roman Empire that seeks to dominate. So it's always looking for power. It exalts itself up into the place of God. And this is contrasted with the way of the Lamb. Jesus exemplifies a different way of being. Rather than seeking his own power, he cedes what power he has to God and humbly submits to him, even to the point of death. And so Revelation calls the church to follow Jesus in its submission to the will of God, rather than following the example of Babylon that seeks to make itself God. So all of that is stuff that we need to keep in mind, and then let's read today, concluding with an understanding of how God deals with sin and judgment and finally fulfills the promises that he's made to his people. Now, we all understand intuitively that the world isn't right. My life's not too bad, but I know deep down inside that things aren't the way they're supposed to be. But there are people in this world who experience that in a more profound way than I can ever know. I imagine if you're an innocent bystander in Gaza right now, you probably feel that way. If you're caught in the war zone in eastern Ukraine, you probably feel that way. And I'm sure the Israelites felt that way when they were under slavery in Egypt. They cried out to God, "God, where are you? Come deliver us." And God sent Moses. And Moses brings plagues on the Egyptians, judging the people and judging their gods. And finally, it all culminates with Pharaoh releasing the children of Israel out of their position of slavery, but then he changes his mind and pursues them with the Egyptian army. And then we see God's greatest act of deliverance, the archetypal act of deliverance in the Old Testament, the Exodus. The army is pursuing them, and God, in the form of the cloud, comes between Israel and the Egyptian army and allows the Red Sea to part so that the children of Israel can go through on dry land. And then he goes with them, and the Egyptians decide to follow, and when they follow into the Red Sea collapses, and they are all destroyed. Right after that, we read this in Exodus 14:30-31. It says, "That day, the Lord saved Israel from the hands of the Egyptians. And Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the seashore. When the Israelites saw the mighty hand of the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and put their trust in Moses, his servant." And so Exodus serves as a template for the children of Israel to understand how God acts in history to save them. And so whenever they encounter difficulty in their future, and it always happens, God's deliverance doesn't seem to last for long before there's a famine or a disease or a raiding army coming against them, the people cry out, "God, will you deliver us as you did back then?" And so the prophets of Israel are full of images of the day of the Lord, of when God intervenes in human history on behalf of the righteous against the wicked. Now the prophet Amos turns this all on its head. Amos begins his book by denouncing Israel's neighbors and enemies. He has a pattern. He says, "For 3 sins of so-and-so, even for 4 I will not relent," and then he proclaims judgment against them. But then in chapter 2, verse 6, Amos says this is what the Lord says, "For 3 sins of Israel, even for 4 I will not relent. They sell the innocent for silver and the needy for a pair of sandals. They trample on the heads of the poor as on the dust of the ground, and they deny justice to the oppressed." In other words, God doesn't play favorites. He doesn't judge Israel's enemies. Rather, he judges evil. And if that evil is embodied in the life of Israel's enemies, then they are going to receive God's judgment. But if God's people are the evil ones, then God will judge them too. So the day of the Lord is a prophetic trope that uses images, particularly drawn from the Exodus, to talk about how God will intervene in human history to judge evil wherever he finds it. Now, the days of the Lord are great and all, but they never seem to live up to the promises that the prophets make. So, for example, Isaiah the prophet speaks, I think, about 150 years before Israel goes into exile, but he sees it coming. And he proclaims that God is going to judge the people, but he also promises that God is going to restore them afterwards. But when he talks about that restoration, he talks about it in these sort of euphoric, cosmic terms. So in Isaiah 2b, for example, he says, "They will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore." And in Isaiah 11:9, it says, "For the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea." Those are wonderful poetic images, but they fall for the experience of the people returning from exile fell well short of the expectations that those created. And so the Jews had to scratch their head. They say, what do we make of these promises of the day of the Lord? And they came to the conclusion that the days of the Lord that they had experienced were not the final fulfillment of God's promise, but rather a foretaste of that fulfillment. And that their true ultimate fulfillment lay at some future date, when God would not simply rescue Israel from the present pickle it found itself in, but rather when God intervened in history to set all problems right, to undo the big problems that had plagued all of them, to judge all evil, to reward all righteousness. And so when we look at this, at Revelation, chapters 6 to 16, the big part of the book, we see a cycle of judgments that all have Day of the Lord images. They're all pointing towards that great fulfillment of what God is going to do to keep the promises that he's made. Now, if you're a literalist and you read through that section of Revelation, you might be a little confused because it kind of feels like we go through and it seems like the world ends and then everything sort of starts again and the world ends and then we go through it again. So I think it's not helpful to look at this as a linear progression of 21 separate events. Rather, I think it's helpful to look at the 7 seals, the 7 trumpets, and the 7 bowls as 3 different perspectives on one series of events. This isn't unheard of in the Bible. So, for example, in Genesis chapter 1, we read a creation narrative that's told from a heavenly perspective. And in Genesis chapter 2, we read a separate creation narrative that's told from a more ground-level human perspective. So what I think we're seeing in Revelation 6 to 16, in the seals, the trumpets, and the bowls, is that God is showing something from 3 different perspectives. It's also important to note that numbers are important symbols. And there are 3 cycles of 7. And the 3 is a number that talks about God, and 7 is a number of completion. And so I think that this is a picture of God's perfect judgment of evil. And then we have to ask ourselves, is this a future reality, a past reality, a present reality? What is this trying to say? Now, this is not something that I'm going to be very doctrinaire about, but my opinion is that this seems to be looking not just at what God will do at some future time, but it's a picture of what he has done, what he is doing, and what he will do. It's really a picture of how God is at work in human history, bringing judgment on sinners and on sin. So all of this happens, but it all seems to sort of climax in an act of final judgment that is probably at some point in the future. What I find really interesting, though, is that it isn't the acts of God punishing sin that actually seems to bring some level of redemption. Every time God judges people, it seems like the people simply harden their hearts, as Pharaoh did. But rather, it is actually as the church embraces its prophetic office that things start to change. In Revelation chapter 11, 3 to 13, we read the seventh trumpet. And in that one, we see something unlike what we see anywhere else in this sequence. So read with me Revelation 11, 3 to 13. And I will appoint my 2 witnesses, and they will prophesy for 1,260 days clothed in sackcloth. They are the 2 olive trees and the 2 lampstands, and they stand before the Lord of the earth. If anybody tries to harm them, fire comes out of their mouths and devours their enemies. This is how anyone who wants to harm them must die. They have the power to shut up the heavens so that it will not rain during the time that they are prophesying. And they have the power to turn the waters into blood and to strike the earth with every kind of plague as often as they want. Now when they have finished their testimony, the beast that comes up from the abyss will attack them and overpower and kill them. Their bodies will lie in the public square of the great city, which is figuratively called Sodom and Egypt, where also their Lord was crucified. For 3.5 days, some from every people, tribe, language, and nation will gaze on their bodies and refuse them burial. The inhabitants of the earth will gloat over them and will celebrate by sending gifts to each other, because these 2 prophets had tormented those who lived on the earth. But after the 3.5 days, the breath of life entered them, and they stood on their feet, and terror struck those who saw them. Then they heard a loud voice from heaven, saying to them, "Come up here." And they went up to heaven in a cloud, while their enemies looked on. At that very hour, there was a severe earthquake, and 1/10 of the city collapsed. 7,000 people were killed in the earthquake, and the survivors were terrified and gave glory to the God of heaven. Now, there are people who look at this passage and they say, oh, well, one of these people said to be able to stop the rain from coming, which is something that Elijah did during his ministry, and the other one is empowered to turn the water into blood and unleash plagues, which is something that Moses did. And so they say this is Moses and Elijah literally come back from the dead to prophesy. But the passage also describes them as the 2 lampstands. And in Revelation chapter 1, Jesus interprets lampstands as a symbol for the church. And so rather than saying that Moses and Elijah are raised from the dead to prophesy, I think what this is trying to say is that the church follows in Moses and Elijah's footsteps, embracing its prophetic witness to the world. So the church follows, and I would suggest, Jesus' example to the world. Jesus speaks truth to power. Jesus confronts the idolatry and the wickedness of the people who want to hold themselves up as being God's followers, and the people hate him for it. And they respond violently for it and destroy Jesus. But Jesus is vindicated in the resurrection. And so the church speaks just as Jesus did, confronting the idolatry and the wickedness of the world, not through power, but through prophetic witness of Jesus' example. And then the church dies in the same way that Jesus does, refusing to bow to the pressure put on it by the beast. It follows the will of the Father in heaven and is killed. But then it is raised just as Jesus was raised. It is vindicated and it ascends to heaven just as Jesus ascends to heaven. And so it is a picture of the church speaking to the world prophetically, laying down its life as Jesus laid down its life, and finding vindication in its resurrection as Jesus found vindication in his resurrection. Now, all of the other times when God judges the inhabitants of the earth, they merely harden their heart. But here it says that the survivors gave glory to the God of heaven. It isn't God's judgment of sin that brings people to repentance. Rather, it is the church, by embracing its role as a prophetic witness to the lamb-like victory of Jesus, that brings the remnant of God's people to repentance. And so this speaks to us today. We shouldn't be praying for God to smite our enemies. Rather, we should be acting as Jesus acted towards them. Doesn't mean sugarcoating everything, but it does mean that we love them and that we refuse to use violence or force or domination against them. even when that costs us dearly. Another thread that gets tied up at the end of Revelation is Babylon. What happens to Babylon, this way of being that exalts itself? Well, things don't end well for Babylon. In spite of its boasts and its arrogance, it is judged too, but not even by God, but rather by its own evil masters. In Revelation 17:60, it says this, "The beast and the 10 horns that you saw will hate the prostitute," that's Babylon, "and they will bring her to ruin and leave her naked. They will eat her flesh and burn her with fire." And so this is a picture of how while these evil empires that exploit and oppress people feel like they are invincible in the end, well, none of them are still around today, even though God's people are still around. Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Greece, Rome, all of them had these invincible empires, and all of those empires have crumbled into dust. When we give ourselves over to evil, when we embrace the way of Babylon, our end is assured. But when we follow the way of Jesus, God will sustain us. Now, another thread here that I think, in my opinion, gets way too much attention is this millennium. People say, well, there's this picture of Jesus coming and throwing Satan and the dragons into a bottomless pit for 1,000 years, which some people interpret as literally 1,000 years. And then the people reign with Jesus for the 1,000 years. Then Satan comes out and leads the people into some sort of battle. This is just a couple of verses, but this is what so many people write about. Within dispensationalist circles, and dispensationalism is the way that sort of the majority of American evangelicals misread Revelation, in my opinion. They argue a lot about this. I'm not going to weigh in like I really know, but I mean, my opinion is that this most likely is pointing towards the church age, in which Satan and the demonic forces are bound in a way that they've never been before, because there are people empowered by Jesus exercising his authority in the world. And that this is going to culminate, though, in a big battle, a final showdown between good and evil. The implications for how we live our life, not really all that important, but rather what we can take from this is that Satan is doomed, and we can draw comfort from that. The climax of Revelation happens in the final chapter, when heaven and earth come together. This centers on the New Jerusalem. In Revelation 21, 1-4, it says, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes, and there will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away.'" This is a vision of the fulfillment of Israel's hope that goes all the way back to the beginning of their history with God. In Exodus 25:8, speaking about building the tabernacle, God says, "Then have them make a sanctuary for me, and I will dwell among them." In Leviticus 26:11 and 12, it says, "I will put my dwelling place among you, and I will not abhor you. I will walk among you and be your God, and you will be my people." And then Ezekiel. Ezekiel is written as Israel has begun the process of being deported into the exile. The people look into the abyss of God's punishment. And Ezekiel speaks a message of hope about the future restoration of Israel. "My dwelling place will be with them, and I will be their God, and they will be my people. Then the nations will know that I, the Lord, make Israel holy when my sanctuary is among them forever." Their hopes are seemingly dashed by the exile, but God promises that one day those hopes will be realized when he comes to dwell with them. Now, part of the problem that we have in understanding what's going on here is that we have a mistaken understanding of what heaven means to the people in the Bible. Heaven is not some place over there that you go when you die. Our hope is not to be pulled out of this world and taken away to heaven. In the Hebrews' way of thinking, heaven is this place where God's will is done. And so what we see in this final image is heaven and earth coming together. In other words, earth becomes heaven. Earth becomes the place where God's will is done. As we pray in the Lord's Prayer, let your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And so the final picture in Revelation is a picture of God's presence in the world. So it describes the New Jerusalem coming down a little bit later as a square, 1,200 stadia. Now, interestingly enough, in metric units, that would be 2,220 kilometers wide and 2,220 kilometers high, or in length and width. And it also is 2,220 kilometers high. Now, the actual square footage of that is roughly equivalent to the Roman Empire at its zenith. So again, this is comparing the empire of God to the empire of Rome. And the other thing is that its height makes it a cube, which is a symbol from the Old Testament. The one place, or two places that we see a cube in the Old Testament, very closely related, is the Holy of Holies in the Tabernacles and the Holy of Holies in the temple. So this is a picture of God's holy presence dwelling on the earth in the way that it dwelt in that one little room in the temple or the tabernacle. But now it is global in scale. It's massive, the size of Rome's empire. And in the Holy of Holies, of course, the whole thing is overlaid with gold. And here the streets are paved with gold. So this is all supposed to be a picture. Now, the holy place was God's presence, but God's presence is dangerous in the Bible because we're a sinful people. People didn't go willy-nilly into the Holy of Holies, the place where God dwells on earth. Rather, the high priest went in once a year, and he did so terrified. They would put a rope around his ankle, and they put bells on the hem of his garments. So he would go into the Ark of the Covenant, and if they heard the bells stop ringing, they knew that God had struck him dead, and they could use the rope to pull the body out. So obviously, the presence of God is not a place that sinful human beings can endure. But here, when God has finally intervened to make us worthy of his presence, he breaks out of the box. And the world is, as Isaiah promised, filled with the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the earth. God's manifest presence will dwell among his people because the power of sin and death and corruption and evil and oppression and injustice has finally been done away with. And now human beings can get on with the business of living a life in the presence of God as he had always intended for us. Evil is destroyed, creation is renewed, and we are made holy. So what is the point of Revelation to us today? Well, first, I think that we need to understand that Revelation is not history in advance. It is not trying to tell us this is the sequence of events that's going to happen right before Jesus' eventual return. Revelation is not meant to scare the hell out of us. Rather, Revelation was intended to give its readers comfort. Remember, it's written to a church that is experiencing injustice and persecution. And what it's saying is, in the midst of your persecution and your weakness, the injustice that you're facing, you might feel that God has abandoned you, but actually God is at work in those processes, bringing about your salvation. And for that original audience, that was incredibly good news. And if you find yourself hurting, wondering where God is in the midst of this, you can be comforted by Revelation as well, because you can know that God is working it out, and he will eventually bring it to its conclusion. So no matter where you find yourself, you can have confidence in where it's all going. Secondly, Revelation is meant to warn us that if we are not discerning, we may find ourselves unwittingly on the wrong side. We see this, for example, in the Gospels, Where the Pharisees and the Sadducees, believing that they are following God, crucify Jesus. Oops. If we do not allow revelation to give us eyes to see in the spiritual realm, we will be easily deceived by the lure and seduction of Babylon. So let's receive the sight that revelation gives us so that we will not live as Babylon in the world. Let's keep our spiritual eyes open so that we can see what Jesus, the Lamb who was slain and who sits on the throne, is doing, so that we can live as faithful witnesses to him.